She went in for depression. She came out not knowing her own name, not knowing she had children, not knowing she had a husband, not knowing what year it was or where she lived or who she had been before the hospital took that from her. She was not a prisoner of war. She was not a criminal. She was a patient at one of the most prestigious psychiatric hospitals in North America, the Allan Memorial Institute in Montreal, Quebec. And what was done to her was funded, designed, and deliberately concealed by two governments simultaneously. The Canadian government knew. The American government not only knew, it was paying for it. Her name was Linda Macdonald. She was admitted to the Allan Memorial in 1963. She was 26 years old. She had 5 children at home. When she was discharged, she had no memory of any of them. Remember Linda? Because what happened to her was not an accident. It was not negligence. It was a program, a deliberate, funded, government-sanctioned program to see how completely a human mind could be erased and whether it could be rebuilt from scratch. The program had a name, MKUltra, and Montreal was one of its most active sites. The Allan Memorial Institute opened in 1943 in a Victorian mansion on the slope of Mount Royal in Montreal. It was affiliated with McGill University, one of the most respected academic institutions in Canada. Its founding director was Dr. Ewan Cameron, a man who had testified at the Nuremberg trials as an expert witness on the psychology of Nazi war criminals. Cameron was, by every conventional measure, a figure of extraordinary professional standing. President of the American Psychiatric Association, President of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, President of the World Psychiatric Association. He was also running experiments on his patients that the Nazis whose psychology he had testified about would have recognized. The experiments were funded partly by the Canadian government and partly by the CIA through a series of front organizations designed to conceal American intelligence involvement in Canadian medical research. The program ran from the early 1950s until 1964. During that time, hundreds of patients at the Allan Memorial were subjected to procedures that were not disclosed to them, that they did not consent to, and that caused damage, in many cases permanent, catastrophic damage, that Cameron's own records document in clinical detail. He called it psychic driving. He called it depatterning. He called it, in the language of his published academic papers, a contribution to the science of human behavior. The patients who survived it called it something else, but many of them, for years afterward, could not find the words, because the words had been taken from them along with everything else. Cameron's central theory was that mental illness could be cured by first erasing the patient's existing personality, destroying the psychological patterns that produced the illness, and then rebuilding a healthy personality in its place. The erasure phase was called depatterning. It involved placing patients in drug-induced sleep for weeks or months at a time, not days, weeks. Patients at the Allan Memorial were kept unconscious through a rotating cocktail of barbiturates and other sedatives for periods ranging from 15 days to 3 months. While they slept, they were subjected to electroconvulsive therapy at doses far beyond anything used in standard psychiatric practice. Normal ECT in the 1950s involved a single shock at a moderate current. Cameron's patients received multiple shocks per day, at 2 to 3 times the standard voltage, for weeks on end. The combination of prolonged drug-induced sleep and massive electroconvulsive bombardment produced what Cameron described in his notes as a regression to an infantile state. Patients who had entered the Allan Memorial as functioning adults emerged from depatterning unable to dress themselves, unable to feed themselves, unable to recognize family members, unable to speak coherently, unable, in documented cases, to remember who they were. Cameron recorded these outcomes in his clinical notes. He described them as evidence that the depatterning was working, that the old patterns had been successfully erased. What he did not record, what his notes contain almost no reference to, was any evidence that the rebuilding phase worked, that the erased minds could be refilled with something healthy. Because it couldn't. The depatterning was real. The rebuilding was not. The rebuilding phase was called psychic driving. It involved playing recorded messages to patients, on tape loops, through speakers placed under pillows, through helmets fitted with headphones, for hours at a time, sometimes for 16 hours a day. The messages were designed to reinforce new behavioral patterns, to replace the erased personality with something Cameron had decided was healthier. The patients could not turn them off. They could not leave the room. They were, in many cases, still in the drug-induced sleep state, receiving the messages in a state of pharmacological unconsciousness, in the theory that the sleeping mind might absorb behavioral programming more readily than the waking one. This theory was not supported by any credible evidence. It was not peer-reviewed. It was not tested in any controlled study. It was Cameron's personal conviction, funded by the CIA's interest in whether human beings could be behaviorally reprogrammed, whether an agent captured by a hostile power could be brainwashed, and whether an enemy agent could be similarly manipulated. The patients at the Allan Memorial were not intelligence operatives. They were people with depression, with anxiety, with the ordinary psychiatric conditions that brought ordinary people to hospitals in the 1950s and 1960s. They were, in Cameron's program, the experimental substrate for a question that had nothing to do with their treatment and everything to do with Cold War intelligence doctrine. Stay with me, because the next part, what the governments knew and when, is what transforms this from a story about one rogue doctor into something much larger. MKUltra was a CIA program formally initiated in 1953 under CIA Director Allan Dulles. Its stated purpose was to develop techniques for controlling human behavior, for extracting information from resistant subjects, for implanting false memories, for creating psychological states that would make individuals susceptible to suggestion or incapable of resistance. The program funded research at over 150 institutions across the United States and Canada, universities, hospitals, prisons, through front organizations that concealed the CIA's involvement. Researchers received grants that appeared to come from private foundations. Some researchers knew the CIA was the actual funder. Some did not. Cameron knew. His correspondence with CIA officials is documented. He was not a passive recipient of funding whose research happened to interest American intelligence. He was an active participant who understood what the program was for and designed his experiments accordingly. The Canadian government's involvement is more complicated and more damaging in some ways than the CIA's. The CIA was a foreign intelligence agency pursuing its own interests. The Canadian government was the government of the country where the experiments were being conducted, on Canadian citizens, in a hospital receiving Canadian public funding. The Defence Research Board of Canada, a federal agency, provided direct funding to Cameron's research. Canadian government officials were aware, at various levels, of what was happening at the Allan Memorial. The Canadian government was not deceived by a foreign intelligence operation, it was a participant in one. Linda Macdonald was admitted to the Allan Memorial Institute in January 1963. She was referred for treatment of depression, a diagnosis that, in 1963, covered a wide range of presentations and was treated with a wide range of interventions, some legitimate and some not. Over the following months, she received 102 electroconvulsive treatments. She was kept in drug-induced sleep for 86 days. She received psychic driving sessions, the recorded messages under the pillow, for an undisclosed period. When she was discharged, she had no memory of her life before the Allan Memorial. She did not know her own name. She did not know she had children. She did not recognize her husband. She had to be taught, from the beginning, the basic functions of adult life, how to use a telephone, how to read, how to manage money. She was 29 years old when she was discharged. She had 5 children who needed their mother. She had a life she could not remember. She spent years rebuilding, not recovering. She never recovered what was taken. Rebuilding, constructing a version of herself from the outside in, from the information other people gave her about who she had been, because the internal knowledge was gone. In 1992, Linda Macdonald was awarded compensation by the Canadian government, $100,000, for the erasure of her identity, for the years of rebuilding, for the 5 children who grew up with a mother who didn't know their names when they came to bring her home. $100,000 for a life. MKUltra was officially terminated by the CIA in 1973. In the same year, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. The order was carried out, Most of the program's records were shredded. What survived, approximately 20,000 documents, survived by accident. They had been misfiled in a financial records building that was not included in the destruction order. They were discovered in 1977 during a Freedom of Information Act request and became the basis for the Senate Church Committee hearings that first brought MKUltra into public view. The Canadian government's response to the disclosure was managed with the same careful language that characterizes its handling of every uncomfortable historical truth. Acknowledgement without accountability, recognition of harm without full disclosure of what it knew and when. A 1986 commission, the Crever Commission, examined the Canadian government's role in the funding of Cameron's research. It found that the Defence Research Board had provided funding without adequate oversight. It recommended compensation for survivors. The compensation process was slow, contested, and inadequate. Many survivors had died by the time it concluded. Many others were too damaged by what had been done to them to navigate a compensation process that required them to document their own harm. The Allan Memorial Institute still operates. It is still affiliated with McGill University. It is still one of the most respected psychiatric facilities in Canada. Cameron's name was removed from its lecture hall in 2018, 55 years after Linda Macdonald was admitted, 54 years after the program ended, 45 years after the files were destroyed. The lecture hall has a different name now. The patients who sat in the rooms above it still don't have their memories back. Linda Macdonald died in 2014. She had spent 51 years living with the consequences of what the Allan Memorial did to her in 1963. 51 years of a rebuilt life, a life assembled from information rather than memory, from the accounts of people who knew her before the hospital took everything. She was by all accounts a person of extraordinary resilience. She raised her children, she rebuilt relationships. She became, eventually, an advocate, one of the first survivors to speak publicly about what had happened at the Allan Memorial, to give the program a human face that the Senate hearings and the Commission reports and the CIA documents had not provided. She did not recover what was taken. Nobody does. The brain does not regenerate destroyed memories. The ECT at Cameron's doses does not produce reversible damage. What was erased at the Allan Memorial stayed erased. Canada has apologized in its fashion. It has paid compensation in its fashion. It has removed Cameron's name from the lecture hall in its fashion. What it has not done, what it has never fully done, is explain how a program like this ran for over a decade in a publicly funded hospital, affiliated with a major university, with the knowledge and partial funding of the federal government, and was allowed to continue. Not by one rogue doctor, not by a foreign intelligence agency operating without the government's knowledge, but by a system, a medical system, an academic system, a government funding system that asked no questions it didn't want answered. That is the dark Canada story, not the CIA, not Cameron, the system that let it happen and the silence that followed. This is dark Canada, where the erased memories finally get spoken aloud. Subscribe, because what happened at the Allan Memorial didn't happen in secret, it happened in the open, and nobody looked.